was thinking just to mention today, first generate compassion, love, and bodhicitta towards all sentient beings. In particular, I thought was a request today also that we dedicate with love and compassion for two people who just passed away. One is, I didn't know him, but Bob Jacobson, who was director of the FPMT Center in Montana, apparently just died. So we can include him in our compassion and dedication. And then also Peter Baker, who was an old dear friend, who after he did the Kopan course in Nepal, he used most I guess much or most of his life savings to purchase Milarepa Center, FPMT Center in Vermont, and completely gave that to FPMT, and then served as director there for many years, helping many people, including me. So we can dedicate and include him in our compassion as well. Hoping they each achieve perfect human rebirths in a pure land, and come to realize bodhicitta, emptiness, and full enlightenment, just as we wish that for all sentient beings. That's our intention studying, right? Is with a sense of compassionate commitment to guiding ourselves and all sentient beings to enlightenment. We'll start our study again. Lama Tsongkhapa's text. So just to remind people, well, first of all, for those who have the text or following along in the actual text, we're on page 264. But I'm just going to review for a minute or two. So first of all, we're in a section, right, where Lama Tsongkhapa is, has been and will continue just for a little while longer, talking about the, let's say the example or the simile of an illusion, right, that things appear in an illusion-like manner. Right? And and this is so right. He previously taught. Just to remind people, right? There was a section on the emptiness. There was a section on how do you meditate on the emptiness of the self, right, of one's own self. Right? So first he presented that, right? And then he presents the section on the meaning of illusion-like. And I think he explained it already, but in today's section he'll explain again why he does them in that order. It'll become clear again why he does them in that order. Why he presents them in that order, I should say. But then for those of you who are, since we're studying, this is a very major text on emptiness, so some of you are quite interested, right? So I'll just remind people from last time, I thought it was quite interesting, right? That Lama Tsongkhapa goes through a few points, many points, but I just wanted to re-emphasize a couple. One is, he goes through this whole point about how there are many ways in which people can experience things as illusion-like that are not what are being talked about in Buddhism. Right? And he makes that very clear, right? And there's one part where he says, what did he say? He says, everyone with an interest in Madhyamaka tenets who has heard a little bit of Dharma being taught about how there's no inherent existence will have sometimes will have these experiences that things will seem, how did he say it? Appearance will simply arise vaguely. There will be this sort of surreal, like if you're studying this topic and reading about it and thinking about it, sometimes you'll have a sense of that things seem surreal and that there's this vague sense of illusion-likeness. And Lama Tsongkhapa says that's a normal part of study and that has nothing to do with the meaning of illusion-likeness from a Madhyamaka perspective. Then he says another point where he says sometimes if you're studying this and you don't correctly analyze emptiness, but you're thinking about it, and sort of in a somewhat imprecise way, things will appear to you as if they're insubstantial, as if you could almost put your hand through them, as if they're like smoke in a way. Buildings and persons will appear to you that way. And he says, and again, that arises, it's an experience, subjective experience you may have, and that is not the meaning of illusion, like from a Madhyamaka perspective. So he gets into this. I just think this thing is very valuable that he sort of, if you get, again, if you're just like sort of, if you're not meditating at all, then it's not relevant maybe, but if you start meditating on emptiness, you'll have these experiences, and what he's saying is, he's saying this out of compassion, right? Because he's saying sometimes people will have some kind of vague experience and will think, oh, I'm understanding emptiness. And he's saying if you're having this particular experience, or this experience, or then he goes through quite a few in different parts of this text, he's like, notice them, but notice, and then be aware those are not a correct understanding of emptiness. And one more point I want to make, because he goes into great detail about this in this text. He also does the same thing in the Lamrim Chenmo, in great detail, I mean, same kind of thing, but in a different way. That he's making a point about the meaning of illusion-like, right? And he's saying, if you want to understand Madhyamaka tenets, you have to understand this, that things being empty of inherent existence doesn't mean they don't exist. And things having what they sometimes call mere existence, or mere appearances, or dependent origination, doesn't mean that they exist truly, or exist inherently. Does that make sense? So it's like things, so things can be empty of inherent, and only Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophers can assert this. Right? This idea that things can lack inherent existence, or lack existence from their own side, and still exist conventionally. Right? And things can exist conventionally while not having existence from their own side. It's a very subtle distinction that is unique to the Prasangika Madhyamaka, consequentialist Madhyamaka school. And he's saying we have to understand that in order to understand illusion-like. Right? So now now we'll pick up in the text, because it's quite interesting. He has an interesting section next. All the sections are pretty interesting, actually, but this next section is at the bottom of 264 for those who have the text. If not, I'll read part of it. So then he said, right, he had just pointed out that if you have this experience, he makes this point that sometimes things can seem, he says here, sometimes when you're thinking about emptiness in an imprecise way, things will seem insubstantial to you, like a rainbow, or like thin smoke, right? And actually you can see how, because there's this metaphor, right? All things exist like a rainbow, or like a dream, or like a... And so you can see how if you start to have some experience where suddenly things are starting to appear to you like they're as if they're like a rainbow, as if they're like a dream, you might think, well, I understand emptiness, I guess. And he's saying, no, that's not the meaning of Madhyamaka, if things just appear. And then he makes a funny point, right? He says, if the mere absence of obstructiveness, right, that means like, that it's not substantial, that it's not obstructive, that it's sort of, what's the word? Insubstantial. If that were the meaning of emptiness, then every time you saw a rainbow, you'd have already realized emptiness. But the rainbow appears insubstantial, but it still appears to exist from its own side. Does that make sense? It still appears to you, to us, to me, to us, to exist inherently. So that's not emptiness then. So now he says, at the bottom of 264, he says, well then, what do you do for illusory objects to appear without mistake? So he went through all these ways in which things could appear illusion-like, but it's not the meaning of emptiness. And now he's saying, well, okay, then what is the meaning? The correct meaning from a Madhyamaka perspective, from a middle way school perspective, of appearing in an illusion-like manner. So now he's going to explain that. So he says, and now he makes an interesting point here. So he's talking about, he goes back to the example of a magical show, right? A magic show, where, remember, and the example they're giving here is where a magician somehow is, through a magic trick, is able to make stones or sticks or something appear as if they're, in this case, horses and elephants, right? That's the illusion, right? So he's saying, for example, when you see illusory horses and elephants with your eye consciousness, and ascertain with your mental consciousness that no horses or elephants in accordance with the appearance exist. In dependence upon that, the ascertainment arises that the appearance of horses and elephants is an illusory or false appearance. And well, and I'll keep going, and then I'll give explanation. Then he says, likewise, well, actually, maybe I will pause there, right? You get the idea there at the magical. So a person's at a magic show, right? And we've already said, like, if you're just there at the magic show and you don't know anything, right? Like a child at a magic show, right? When they see the illusory horses and elephants, they just go, wow, that's a big elephant. I hope it doesn't step on me. And, wow, I want that horse. Can I take it home, right? It seems to really exist, right? So a child might think, oh, the horse really exists. I want to buy the horse. Mom, Dad, will you buy me the horse? Right? It seems to really exist. Does that make sense? And that's like us, by the way. That's the metaphor for us, right? But then he's saying, like, here, like somebody who studied magic, let's call it that way, right? Goes to the show. That's what he's getting at now. So somebody who studied magic goes to the show, and he's making an interesting distinction which he's going to explain. He says, to their eye consciousness, a horse and elephant still appear, right? They still see the trick. Does that make sense? So the horse and elephant appear. But their mental consciousness, their mind, knows it's not real. Does that make sense? And so there's this simultaneous process. Their sensory consciousness, in this case the eye, has the appearance of horses and elephants. Right? And that doesn't stop. Their eye consciousness doesn't stop having that appearance because they're also at the show. At the same moment, at the same time, their mental consciousness is aware because of reasoning, because of understanding, because of their insight. Well, those aren't real horses and elephants. I can't take those home. It's just a magic show. It's because of a trick. And that's, so then to that person, this is not emptiness yet, but this is the metaphor, right? The horses and elephants are appearing, but they know they're illusory. Now he's going to explain how that applies to the meditator. Likewise, persons and so forth undeniably appear to your conventional mind while you ascertain by means of a reasoning consciousness that they are empty of inherent existence established by way of their own entities. In dependence upon these two, ascertainment arises that persons are illusory or false appearances. Now he says, and I'll read one more paragraph and I'll pause again. Due to that, if the meditation on space-like emptiness, a meditative equipoise in which not even a mere particle of the object aims for apprehending attributes exists, hits home, an illusion-like emptiness will appear as you look at the appearances of objects in the subsequent attainment period after you have arisen from that meditation. So in that, actually these two paragraphs right here are really, I mean he's going to explain more, but these get at the essence of what illusion-like means. So for the first time he's kind of clarified what it doesn't mean in various ways and its usefulness, but here he's getting at the essence of it, right? And so what he's saying is, and actually I'm going to do the paragraphs in the opposite order, right? What he's getting at is because you have to first correctly identify the object of negation, right? In this case, and what did he teach about that? In this case, it's the self, right, of yourself. So how yourself appears to exist intrinsically, inherently, to exist by its own nature, to exist independently, we could say. Right? You have to give rise to your own subjective experience of this sense of self you have that seems to exist right there as real from its own side. Right? And then you apply the reasoning he taught, right, which is not one and not many in this case, in the text he taught about, the reasoning of not one and not many. And then he's saying here, right, if you do that, eventually you'll reach a point where you'll have what he calls what does he call here? A meditative equipoise, a meditation on space-like emptiness. So what is that? Right? That means that the person who's meditating eventually comes to some kind of inner recognition, right? Inner insight. Wow, that intrinsic self that I was grasping at doesn't exist with even an atom, even a particle, even a speck. Nothing exists of that. That doesn't exist at all. Right? And so to that person's mind, they're completely focused on the non-existence of that non-existent phenomena. So to the mind at that time, the appearance, he says, is space-like, right? In the sense that no conventional things are appearing. All that's appearing is a mere negation. That's what they call it, a mere negation of that independent self. Does that make sense up to that point? Because if that doesn't make sense, the next part won't make sense. Does that make sense? So the person gave rise to, it's like the person gave rise to their own subjective experience of a hallucination inside themselves. Us, people like us, right? And then they have a space-like in the sense that, wow, that hallucination is a hallucination. It doesn't exist, right? There's some recognition like that. Wow, it doesn't exist. My hallucination that I've been grasping at since beginningless time, and since the moment of my birth I've been grasping at it, all the time it's been there, is a hallucination, right? It doesn't exist at all. And so there's this, at that time, the subjective experience is just like space. It's like, that's why they use the word emptiness, right? It's like, it's that it's empty of existing. That thing doesn't exist. Right, so he says, not even a mere particle exists, right? Nothing exists of that. Because actually, if you're like, right, it's the same thing. If you're looking for the illusory horse, right, and then you go and you inspect, it's not like what's the word? Nothing, there's no horse, right? Similarly, the intrinsically existent self, you realize there's no intrinsically existent self, right? So it's a space-like equipoise, an equipoise on a mere absence of something. And then he says what happens. So you're in the space-like equipoise, right? Where it's just like, just apprehending a mere negation of the self, of the intrinsically existent self. But then he points something out. He says, after such a meditative equipoise, when you open your eyes, when your eyes were open if you were sitting like this, but when you start to look around again objects appear. Does that make sense? Again, conventional appearances occur to your sensory consciousnesses, right, at that time, your ears, your eyes, your nose. And at that time, right, so he says here, persons and so forth, that means everything, right, all different conventional phenomena undeniably appear, right? And he's making a point there, right, because sometimes people who have this space-like equipoise, who misunderstand emptiness, they call it, they have too broad an object of negation. So they have this experience, which is the wrong experience, by the way, so we're being careful here, right? Where they negate everything, right? And then when things undeniably appear, they just go, oh, none of that's real, none of it exists. That's wrong. Things do appear, right? And they do have a kind of existence. So he's saying, undeniably, persons and chairs and tables and buildings, everything undeniably appears, right, to your senses. And he's saying, so to your conventional mind, to your rather, what's the word? It says appear to your conventional mind. So they appear conventional, is what he's saying, to your sensory consciousnesses. But at that time, due to your previous meditation on emptiness, you understand, oh, they don't exist in the way they appear. Right? They appear as if they exist from their own side, whereas actually they're just appearances because of causes and conditions. Right? They have no substantial, no intrinsic, that's the right word, no intrinsic existence. They're mere appearances arising due to causes and conditions. So you see things, right? And when you see an object that you tend to desire, right? that object definitely appears as if it exists out there from its own side. But at this time, your mental consciousness knows, oh, it exists as a mere appearance, as merely labeled by the mind, right? And so, it's appearing as if it exists independently, but it doesn't really exist in the way it appears. And what he's saying is that's the meaning of illusory mind, right? And do you see the analogy, right? Like the person who's trained in magic, when they have the appearance of the horses and elephants, the horses and elephants still appear, but they know, oh, it doesn't exist the way it appears. In a similar way, the person who's meditated effectively and correctly on emptiness, when conventional phenomena appear, they still appear to their sense consciousness as if they exist independently. But now the person knows they don't exist that way. Previously, the person didn't know that. We didn't know that. At this time, the person realizes that, and so their mental consciousness is able to understand, oh, things are appearing a certain way, but they don't exist in the way they appear. And then their relationship to those things changes. In the same way, right? It's like if you're at the magic show and you think it's real, right? You might even think, somebody might think, if the person were a thief, right? They might think, oh, I'm going to steal that horse, then I'll have some wealth, right? But the horse doesn't even exist, right? We're like that in convention, right? We have these relationships to things where you think they exist intrinsically, and so we desire them, we get angry at them, we get jealous, and so on, because we're misapprehending things, right? This person who's meditated effectively in emptiness, now their mental consciousness knows, oh, things don't exist the way they appear, so there's no point grasping at them. There's no point being jealous. There's no point being angry at some, like in other words, if a person who I think is making me angry, if I know they don't exist in the way they appear, then there's no basis for getting angry, for example. Right? It'd be like getting angry at the illusory elephant because it pooped, and you think it pooped in your area or something. Like, if the illusory elephant's illusory, then the poop's illusory, right? Yeah.
So, if with your example, why get angry if they don't really exist? Why have any emotions if things people don't really exist?
There's a beautiful, you made me think of this, there's this beautiful description where, I can't remember the exact wording, but I'll get the essence of it, I think. But basically, there's this beautiful description of that, where it says, because, the person who's at this point, right, if you think where this appears in the Lamrim, first I'll answer your question really, like, where this appears in the Lamrim, you've already meditated on bodhicitta, right? And so, a person who's meditating on bodhicitta, they often say this, right, that your attitude towards sentient beings is like the love of a parent for their only child, right? So you have that kind of love for sentient beings. And then
is there a
when you
recognition of that sentience always, despite the fact that the illusory appearance of a person?
Right, because the person still does exist, right? First of all, we know that, right?
Right.
The person exists conventionally, and they don't realize. Part of what you're because part of what you're recognizing when you see this is that they don't exist in the way they appear to themselves, but they grasp at a false appearance, and then they suffer. And so actually the feeling then, they say, for bodhisattvas at this point, is their compassion even becomes stronger, right? Because they recognize, wow, this person doesn't have to suffer. They now know, actually. Before it was just an idea, now they know more experientially. Wow, this person who I love and cherish doesn't have to suffer, but they're suffering because they don't see themselves and things accurately. And so actually, in a way, your compassion can become stronger. Your compassion even becomes stronger at this point, because you recognize, on the one hand, sentient beings are worthy of love and worthy of compassion, and they're only suffering because they're misperceiving things. And you actually now perceive things more accurately, and so first of all, they don't have to suffer. Secondly, if they see what you've just seen, they won't suffer in the same way. Thirdly, now you have the tool to actually help them. So if anything, there's more, what they say is, things like, you can see that actually, like things like anger or jealousy become silly in a way. Childish is the way they say. From this perspective, those kinds of emotions, the person experience, not just like judge, I'm not talking about like judgmental, but experiences them as sort of silly. Like, whereas love and compassion are reasonable at that point. Because it's like this person who I've been related to infinitely over infinite amount of time and will continue to be related to infinitely over an infinite amount of time, which is the nature of our interdependence, is causing themselves and others suffering because they don't see that they don't exist in the way they think they exist. And so you want to help them see reality so they can not suffer. Does that make sense, though, why the one emotion? So at that time, what they say is that, actually what they say really is that this insight undermines the afflictive emotions. That's why I give example, anger, jealousy, pride. Like, in other words, like the same thing. Like if you recognize that the independent, intrinsic I doesn't exist, but then you're going to like be self-promoting in a prideful way, that just seems stupid, right? Whereas if you see somebody else being self-promoting in a prideful way and suffering because of it, and all the suffering that comes with that, you want to help them. Does that make sense? So certain emotions in the light of this kind of insight, certain emotions still do very much make sense. And other emotions seem ridiculous, really, is I think the idea. And that's part of why, if you look back, oftentimes I say this, if you look in Buddhist psychology, there's these lists, right? The afflictive emotions and then the unafflictive emotions. There's like there are afflictive emotions that cause suffering, and then there are really unafflictive emotions, I'll call them. They were like equanimity, love, compassion, and so on. And part of what I think is fascinating, one is, in the moment, the afflictive emotions are agitated states. And they cause suffering at the time and also in the future. But another point is that the afflictive emotions are unrealistic, whereas the virtuous emotions, the positive emotions or whatever, are realistic actually. And so this insight is fascinating in the sense that it undermines the basis of the afflictive emotions because they were unrealistic to begin with. Whereas it supports the positive emotions, if you already have them, which we do. We all have to some extent, but if you cultivate them especially, then they actually become even more powerful at this time because they're supported by this insight. When you understand interdependence, your sense of love and affection for others increases, right? Whereas your sense of like, wanting to own everything so nobody else can have it seems totally stupid, right? Like, that's the idea here, is that, like, does that make sense, kind of? Okay, because I want to make sure that makes sense about the emotions part.
Kind of mind-blowing, but yes, thank you.
So let's say like the mental consciousness object like is a horse, right? And then the eye consciousness object is a horse. So how do you define, like, mental consciousness object is a horse, and then at the same time the eye consciousness object is a horse. So how do you negate, what do you negate then? The mental consciousness is a horse, right? You see a horse with mental consciousness, and then with the eye consciousness you see a horse too. So how do you choose which object to negate?
Oh, I see. If you mean when you're doing the operative negation of an object, of an external thing, then.
No, because you said that so the object of negation is so the illusion, like.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, sometimes, in this case, I mean, he was giving an analogy of the, but actually, okay, it's an important point you're making. Lama Tsongkhapa used the example of a magician's illusion, right? And he said, so your eye consciousness sees a horse, but then the mental consciousness knows it's not a horse.
Yeah.
Here, you're drawing an interesting point, because things can appear as intrinsically existent to all six consciousnesses, right? So, which includes the mental. You're making a good point, you're right.
Yeah.
Like, so, in other words, like, so my eye consciousness can see a horse as, and it seems to exist intrinsically. It appears that way to my eye consciousness. If the horse neighs, my ear consciousness could perceive that as if it exists out there independently. But also, in this case, now we're getting to actual emptiness, right? Not the example, but the main point. Let's put it that way, which is emptiness. So you're right, that sometimes what's appearing, sometimes what's happening is that to one's mental consciousness, things are appearing. And now, subsequent attainment, right? You're not meditating on emptiness directly at this time. So you're right. At that time, say the horse could appear to your mind as inherently existent. But then, at that time, another part of your mental consciousness is analyzes, as he says, right, with reasoning consciousness, and then has a recognition. Oh, like, the horse is appearing to my mind as if it's inherently existent, but then another part of my mental consciousness looks at that and says, oh, but that's not how it actually exists. So you're right, sometimes it could be the mental consciousness that's apprehending things as inherently existent, and then another part of the mental consciousness recognizes that's a false appearance. Yeah, you're right.
I have a
So,
question.
oh yeah.
So, can you exaggerate then you mentioned like virtue versus like the afflictive emotion you're trying to minimize. So, but can you also have at some point exaggerate the virtue side? I don't know.
Oh, I see. Yeah. There's interesting. Yes, I mean, there's actually an interesting point where there's a beautiful. I think it's like a poetic text. I think it's sort of. I think in the original it was poetic in Sanskrit. That there's the great Buddhist master Chandra Goman is his name that wrote. It's in English. Somebody translated. It's called. The translation. Mark Tatz translated. He called it "Difficult Beginnings." And Chandra Goman's very funny. He's a very smart, very funny writer. Ancient Indian writer. He lived at the same time, I think, as Chandra Kirti. They said they debated. The two of them had a debate at some point. Actually, I'm going to go off a short tangent. Chandra Kirti was considered was the genius, right? The greatest. And for a little while, Chandra Goman started to beat Chandra Kirti in debate. And Chandra Kirti thought, this is very peculiar. Nobody can beat me. But nobody beats me in debate. And so then he checked and he saw that Chandra Goman was a mystical, a mystic who had achieved insight, and he was able to. So he was going and asking Avalokiteshvara. He could have visions of Avalokiteshvara. So he was going off and saying, Chandra Kirti asked me this, the Avalokiteshvara. How should I answer? And Avalokiteshvara would say, tell him this. And then you go back. And then Chandra Kirti said, well, that's not really fair, or something. That was a very funny story. But anyway, Chandra Goman rather addressed what you're saying, where he was saying, for beginners, people who haven't yet understood emptiness, at this point, he was saying, he gave these funny examples. I can't remember the exact. It's been a long time since I read it, but he said something like, he was getting at what you were saying. He was saying, he was describing his beginning experiences, and he was saying, when I meditate on love for others, he was kind of like, I start developing love, and then suddenly I'm very attached to them. So my love kind of goes astray and becomes attachment. Then he says, then I meditate on impermanence, to let go of my attachment, and the attachment decreases, but then I don't care about anybody. And then he's saying and then I think, well, this is no good, so then I meditate on, compassion, maybe, I can't remember if he says it, and then I start to get overly anxious and worried about people, he says, that's no good. Whatever, so you're saying, he gave an example like you were saying, where not really that it gets exaggerated, but it kind of goes astray because you start grasping at things in the wrong way. And he was kind of saying, this is normal at the beginning. I think he was sort of saying, that at the beginning it's quite tricky, right? Because we're so familiar with the mental afflictions that they sort of, sometimes our attempt to give rise to a virtuous state of mind can get contaminated or mixed in with our mental afflictions. And so it gets, like the exaggerations that we tend to have, right, infiltrate, in a way, our positive emotions. So, and that's common, right? You meditate on love for others and suddenly you start grasping at them in a way, which is not love anymore, but, so that does happen. And I guess what Chandra Goman was getting at, I think, was that for the beginner, one has to keep applying different antidotes, right? So you meditate on one, and then when you have that, then you meditate on some other antidote. And I think the idea, though, is that once one gains insight into emptiness, then one can give rise to positive emotions much more easily without those exaggerations coming into play. So I think that's the idea, is that at the beginning it's just part of the process, and you just keep going, and you it's like you're trying to stay on the road, and then you start drifting off, and you have to come back, and you're drifting off, you have to come back. Maybe you drift this way, you come back, then this way. But once you understand emptiness, I think then it becomes easier to stay in the middle of the road.
Question a little bit tangent too, but there's something I'm curious about, the 5 kind of regular sense consciousnesses and appearance of objects, things appearing as discrete objects. So it sounds like it's clear from what you're saying that it's not just the mental consciousness that dices things up into discrete this and that. It happens at the level of vision. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, do Buddhist philosophers discriminate between kind of raw sensory input, just like the pixels on the screen, and then the division of those into discrete objects? And as one becomes highly realized, does the slicing and dicing it all away at some level.
Say what you mean by slicing and dicing it, because I want to be trying to understand.
You know, like using computer monitor as a metaphor, right? It's just like dot 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 dot. It's raw visual data, and apprehending that, you see, oh, that's there's Pac-Man, there's the ghost, whatever, right? You know, that's the level at which it becomes discrete objects visually. Does that process, it sounds like there is a difference between those two things, but happening within the context of visual consciousness.
Which two things?
Just raw data and, oh, there's this and that and the other thing.
Yeah,
There's like a visual field, and then laid on top of that, I can say, oh, that's an object, that's an object, that's an object, at a visual, perceptual, in that kind of context. I just wanted to clarify that is how things are described, or and if so, like, does that process of identifying individual objects change as when it becomes realized?
I think. Tell me if this answers your question. Like, I think this gets you your question. Like, when they talk about again, I'm going back to say Buddhist epistemology or Buddhist from the Pramana section area about perception. What they would say is that discrimination, because part of what you're getting is discrimination, right? Discriminating things from other things, and that's one of the they call it like an omnipresent mental factor. So it's always there. So in other words, as long as there's consciousness, and whether it's visual consciousness or auditory consciousness or mental, any of the but in this case visual. That some sense of discrimination goes along with that, and I guess that like if you think of like even a newborn baby that sort of turns towards the mother's face or something, there's a discrimination right from like there's always discrimination there in a way, as long as there's a certain kind of consciousness, in that case visual consciousness. So that's always there, and I guess what we can discriminate varies according to what we discriminate depends on both the quality of our eye organs, but also to our learning. Like maybe if you don't know what a Pac-Man is, then you won't differentiate Pac-Man or something. But if you don't know how to play the game, you won't know that, right? If nobody's told you yet. So that's always there is one part of the answer, I think. And then I guess going though to the other question, what they say is that it's an interesting question. Like even after someone has achieved a direct realization of emptiness, for example, so you're asking as somebody progresses on the path, what they say is that when that person's, when they're in meditative equipoise, at that time, as Lama Tsongkhapa was kind of getting at here, no conventional objects are appearing to them. Only the ultimate truth of emptiness is appearing when the person's in meditative equipoise. So like their other consciousnesses, for example, are not functioning actually at that moment. All this, their mind is completely absorbed in the mental consciousness, which is just realizing the mere negation. But when they come out of that state, of course, all their sensory consciousnesses sort of reboot, I don't know, start functioning again. And at that time, discrimination returns. They again discriminate, and again things appear to, and that's part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is implying here, is that for that person, even if somebody on the 5th bhumi or 8th bhumi or something, 7th bhumi, even on the pure bhumis, the 8th, 9th, and 10th, things still appear to their sensory consciousnesses as if they were intrinsically existent. That's what they say. So to that bodhisattva, they still discriminate things in that way. Even only a Buddha doesn't. Only a Buddha doesn't. And then sometimes they say, for a Buddha, in Vajrayana at least, they say because actually discrimination is one of the 5 aggregates. It's listed, right? That quality of discriminating is one of the 5, right? Listed in the 5 aggregates, discrimination. And so for a Buddha in Vajrayana, at least, they say the discrimination becomes discriminating wisdom at that time, which we all have seeds of in a way, but at that time it becomes just something like that. that kind of wisdom. So that's a different thing. But yeah, so discrimination doesn't stop though. In that sense, it's always there as part of our way of. It's always there, yeah, even in our visual consciousness. So we're always discriminating something. You know, even somebody who can't, let's say somebody who can't discriminate the Pac-Man, they'll still discriminate like light from dark. You know, like the screen is lighter and what's next. You know, a little baby, for example, could still say, oh, this is bright and that's darker, and what's the bright thing, you know, something like that. So there's always some level. Sometimes discrimination is much more simplistic, sometimes it's more complicated, but they say there's always discrimination. Does that kind of answer that? So now, the next paragraph, I'll just say. So, Lama Tsongkhapa says how there is, I'm going to just read the outline heading here. It says, how there is consequently no need for a separate reasoning settling appearances as illusion-like. This is quite interesting too, I think. So he says, thus you analyze phenomena a lot, with reasoning analyzing whether or not they are established by way of their own entities. Right? So first thing there, I think it's interesting, he says a lot, right? And then what is he getting at? We have to practice. Right? In other words, if you think about the reasoning that he gave once or twice, it's not going to have much, it's not going to have a very profound impact on you, right? You'd have to really continually engage in that process many, many times, right? If you're interested in emptiness, sincerely, you study a lot, you meditate over and over on this, right? Using reasoning, right? So he says, you analyze phenomena a lot, with the reasoning analyzing whether or not they are established by way of their own entities. And you generate a very strong certainty that they lack inherent existence. Right? And that's part of it, is right, like at the beginning, remember I've said this before, like at the beginning, it should, even if we with that quote from Arya Deva, right? At the beginning you just may have a doubt. Well, do things really, you know, if you start analyzing, and then at some point you'll have a doubt. Maybe things don't exist the way, inherently, intrinsically. And remember Arya Deva says, that tears some sort to shreds, right? Because it's the beginning, it's like it's part of your process, right? It's like saying if you keep going in that direction, you're going to realize emptiness and become liberated. So then you keep going until you develop. So he says, so you go beyond doubt then. In other words, the sense that you keep going. When you have a doubt, you keep meditating, right? And you keep analyzing. And you keep using different lines of reasoning. And eventually you come to a clarity or a certainty that things lack inherent existence. Then he says, subsequently, when you look at the appearances that arise, they will appear like illusions. There is no separate method for settling the illusion-like emptiness. And that's an interesting sentence there, because I think sometimes people have other ideas, actually, than what Tsongkhapa is saying. Sometimes people think that the main practice would be to say, oh, this is like a dream. Oh, this is like a dream. And what he's saying here is, actually, if you think about it, just I'm going to say my own logical analysis here. If you just walk around saying things are like a dream, things are like a dream, well, that will give you some sense of things being dreamlike, right? But that will be more like what he described earlier, this sort of vague, sort of dreamy, surreal experience, which is not the intended point, right? But that's different than if you analyze and meditate on emptiness, as he's saying, then things will actually appear in this illusion-like or dream-like manner. And then one other point I'll just make as a side point to that is, sometimes that he said this earlier, one way of using these metaphors of illusion, like there are various ways. I think there are two ways that I can think of from what he's been saying to use them. One is to recognize how illusion-like implies dependent origination. Does that make sense? Like things still appear, right? The horse appears because of the magic trick. A reflection in the mirror appears because of the mirror and the face and light and all that, right? So things appear due to dependent causes and conditions. That can help you understand dependent origination. Right? And another is things don't exist as they appear. So I guess my point is that if you were thinking, all of this exists like a reflection, and you leave it at that, that's not very profound, right? But if you say, well, what does that mean, that things exist like a reflection? Well, a reflection is the mirror, the face, the light, and so on, and then there's an appearance to the eye consciousness. Well, how do the things he's saying reason, right? So here you might use reason to say, well, in what way is my experience of today like that? I'm not looking in a mirror. What does that mean? Right? And then if you were to say, well, things are appearing due to causes and conditions, in what sense? And you analyze that, right? Well, so on. You could say karma, you could say, analyze how visual appearances or auditory appearances arise due to causes and conditions, right? Then you're using that analogy of or the metaphor or the analogy of illusion-like as part of your reasoning process. Does that make sense? So that's another way to do it, is to use that as a part of your reasoning, which we'll get into more. So he says, therefore, even when engaging in activities on the side of conduct, such as prostrations and circumambulations, you should engage in them affected by the ascertainment of your analysis as explained earlier. Therefore, you should train in the illusion-like appearances and perform them from within that. Once you have trained in it, they will appear like illusions even through the mere recollection of the view. So there he's making a couple of points. One is, when you're doing, what's the word? Method, what they call your conduct, means like method practices, right? And that's not just, he gives the example of prostration, circumambulations, but that could mean generosity, ethics, patience, training in compassion, going and serving others, for example, doing some kind of acts of service. What he's saying is, when you're doing any kind of thing like that, right, any of those practices, if you're interested in emptiness, if you're trying to practice Mahayana Dharma, then you try to do so within this kind of recognition, right? And that's we've taught that, right? Like, so for example, that the giver and the gift and the recipient are dependently originated, right? Are interdependent and therefore lack intrinsic existence. The ethical person, the actual practice of ethics, and so on, are interdependent, right? There's no practice of ethics without the person training in ethics, and there's no person training in ethics without the practice of ethics. So they're interdependent, so they don't exist intrinsically, and so if you keep analyzing that, then your method practices become influenced by wisdom. And therefore they become an antidote to samsara. Does that make sense? Otherwise, if you do ethics without that awareness, it's still good, right? It's good karma, but it's not an actual antidote to samsara, is it? Like, so in other words, if you just train in ethics, because you want to create virtuous karma, that's good, right? That's a good thing to do, and it leads to positive results, good karmic results in the future, right? But it doesn't lead beyond samsara unless you're doing this, right? Unless you're doing it under the influence of the wisdom, understanding, emptiness. Same thing with generosity, right? If you're generous but you don't recognize emptiness, then your generosity will give rise to abundance or resources in the future. But it won't be something that leads beyond samsara unless you're aware of emptiness as you're doing it. That's what he's saying. So by doing this, your virtuous actions become an antidote to samsara, actually. In the same way, right, if you were practicing Vajrayana, and if you're not aware of emptiness, well, actually, I'm not sure that it's Vajrayana, but you could be saying I'm doing Vajrayana, but it's not, it may not be. The idea there also is that one does it under the influence of, or an inseparable method in wisdom, a practice of inseparable method in wisdom. So it's the same point. And then he makes another point here at the last sentence, right? Where I'll just read it again, where he says, once you have trained in it, they will appear like illusions through mere recollection of the view. And so there he's saying, it's like anything, isn't it? Like, it's like many things. And if you train in this over and over and over repeatedly and sort of also continuously, then eventually, at the beginning, it's difficult. You have to actually, bring up the object of negation, engage in a kind of deep analysis of, is it one or is it many, and all that, right, that he taught. But here he's saying, if you do that over and over again, and you have more and more familiarity with the view of emptiness, then there will come a point where, if you're doing some other activity, that just thinking, a very brief thought of the view, right, because you've had some previous meditative experiences and contemplative experiences, and you familiarize your mind with them, then just the thought, oh, this is empty, that experience will come back, and then it'll be easy to integrate those two. And that's the same, actually, I'll just remind you, like, that's the same as any mental thing, right? Like, in other words, whatever we're familiar with becomes easy for us to give rise to, right? Like, it's like, I sometimes use this example, like, if a person is an extremely, extremely angry person, right, like very, very, what's the word, short-tempered, then just saying, like, all you have to say to them, right, is like, you could just say, like, all you have to say to that person is, oh, that person doesn't like you. Boom, they're angry, right? Like, or, oh, so-and-so said you're a jerk. Oh, like, immediately they're angry, right? Like, it's very easy and instantaneous to give rise to anger. here what he's saying is, if you familiarize yourself a lot with emptiness, then all you have to say is, oh, it's empty, and boom, it'll arise because it's so familiar. Does that make sense? Whereas if we're not familiar with emptiness, it's very hard to give rise to that because we haven't thought about it much. So whatever's familiar arises easily to the mind. And so he's saying if you are continually training yourself in emptiness, then emptiness will appear. Even when you're doing ordinary activities, if you remind yourself of emptiness, you'll be able to integrate that. Of course, if you're not actually studying and meditating, contemplating and meditating on emptiness, and then you think, oh, this is all empty, then it's just going to be words that won't give rise to any recognition. So he's saying that's why you have to, what does he say? Repeatedly, with a lot of reason, he says, analyze phenomena a lot with reasoning. So it's that familiarity that will make it easier to give rise to the experience. Okay, let's start the next paragraph. Some of you may find this a relief. The first few words of the next paragraph, he says, put simply and easy to understand. I was like, I was thinking last night when I was reviewing, I was like, oh, some people will be like, easy to understand, because it's not an easy topic, right? Emptiness. Okay, so put simply and easy to in a way that's easy to understand. The method for seeking this ascertainment is as follows. So now he's going to give it's like kind of like a summary. Does that make sense? He's going to summarize here. So he says, so now he's going to go through step by step. So first, as was explained earlier, you should cause the generality of the object of negation by reasoning to appear well. So first of all, I want to pause there because the word generality could seem strange. I think it seems strange. It's like, what he's getting at there is like, sometimes call it a meaning generality. It means the mental image. So when he said generality there, what he means is your own mental image there. So you should cause your own mental image, generality, your own mental understanding, of the object of negation by reasoning to appear well. Consider well how ignorance in your continuum superimposes inherent existence and identify it. Okay, so that's the first point, and that's in some ways, you and Kensher has said before, that's in some ways the most important point and maybe the most difficult point, is to correctly identify the object of negation in your own experience. And I said this when we covered this in that section, but I just want to emphasize it here because he's saying it right. He's saying the ignorance in your continuum. Does that make sense? So one point is, it doesn't help at all to say somebody else is very ignorant. That's one point there. Right? If you say, oh wow, so-and-so is really ignorant, that's not going to help liberate you, obviously, right? But then there's another point, which is you have to really identify that in your own experience, right? So you read all these words about inherent existence, intrinsic existence, existence from its own side, independent existence. But then there comes a point where you have to sit down and look inside yourself and say, well, in what way do I grasp at that myself right now? Does that make sense? And there are many ways to do that, right? Sometimes they say, in some texts, they say, think about if somebody were to accuse you wrongly of something. You would feel this very strong sense of I. You could think of when you feel hurt. You could think of when you feel angry. You could think of when you really desire something. There's a sense of I that seems to exist intrinsically from its own side, right? And then you get more and more, actually it's always there. Those are just, in those texts, what they're pointing out is that when we're beginning, we have to give rise to that experience in a more visceral way in order to identify it, right? Eventually you recognize it's there all the time. But when we're starting, there are different examples they use, like, a time when you're afraid, right? And then you notice that sense of I. Whatever, so whichever method works for you. Does that make sense? You have to try all these, you can try different methods but he's saying, right, until you develop a clear sense of your own experience of that intrinsically existent I, which is the object of negation. And so he's saying, if you don't do that and you don't identify it, and here identify means in your own subjective internal experience, right? So he's saying that's the first point. And if you don't do that point, it's not going to work, right? So you do that. Then the second point is, he says, once you've identified, and only after you've identified it, right? Then, he says, then you should consider how if there were such inherent existence, it would not be beyond oneness and difference, and how there is damage to assertions of it as either. Right? So this is the reasoning he already presented that we went into in detail, right? Where you recognize, okay, if that thing, that intrinsic I exists, first there's what do you call it, the pervasion, right? That means this not understanding that if an inherent thing exists, it has to exist as one thing or as many things, right? And then you have to analyze, well, is this my own experience of I, of self, of ego, whatever, is it singular, one thing, or is it plural? Is it many things, right? And then you analyze as he taught, right? So if it were one thing, well, you know, anyway, we can go back and look through all those reasonings, I shouldn't go into detail, right? But there are many different reasonings that he gives to make this point that, yeah, like for example, there are 5 aggregates, right? There are 6 elements, right, that make up a person, right? You know, and so if the I were, if there were many, then if the I were all, if each of, you know, like is the I, each of those, is the I separate and is it an owner of those? Anyway, there's a whole analysis you can go through. So you go through that, right? And you understand that it has to, if an intrinsically existent thing truly exists, it has to be intrinsically, from its own side, it has to be findable as one or as many. And if you recognize it can't be one, also can't be many, then you develop the third point. So you should induce an ascertainment, seeing the damage, and finally stabilize the ascertainment, thinking a person does not even have the least inherent establishment. And then he says, like that, you should train in the emptiness factor a lot. And you hear the message there. One is you have to engage in reasoning, right? This is Lama Tsongkhapa very clear, isn't it? You have to engage in a reasoning process. It's not enough to just meditate on nothingness or space out, right? And the Dalai Lama often emphasizes this point too, right? It's reasoning. This is a reasoned process, right? And there's no other way to come to an ascertainment of emptiness, is what Lama Tsongkhapa is asserting. And the other is you have to do it over and over again. And I'll just remind you, I mentioned this another time a little bit, but in Lama Tsongkhapa's own life even that was true, wasn't it? Like there's that story I mentioned, right, where he, you know, he was like one of the greatest scholars on the doctrine of emptiness alive, you know. And he actually, like, I remember I said Chandra Goman was talking to Avalokiteshvara, Lama Tsongkhapa was talking to Manjushri, right? And Manjushri said, go on retreat, go off and meditate, you know. And he went off and meditated. And he did like, I think 4 years or something of retreat. And he still, you know, he still had questions after that. And then he kept meditating and he did more retreat. And the point of that point of his biography is that even he had to do this, right? It's no exception. It's not like because you're a genius, you don't have to go contemplate and meditate and think about this over and over again. So he's saying, like that, you should train in the emptiness a lot. And you'll develop questions, and that's where the study comes in, right? If you start meditating on emptiness in this way, and then you like look at the text like this one, then you go back and meditate more, then you look at the text, then you meditate more. You know, and you, it's a dialectic, right? And your understanding deepens, both experientially, intellectually, and experientially. It deepens and deepens, right? And so he's saying, so you keep doing that process, right, where you identify the object of negation, you recognize the pervasion, that it must exist as one or as many, you engage in the reason analysis, and you come to this ascertainment, or this clarity, or this insight into emptiness. And then he says, the next section, right, so you meditate on emptiness. Then he says, how persons appear illusion-like without your forgetting emptiness. So he says, so he's saying after you come out of meditations on emptiness, right, then you should let the undeniable appearances of the designations of persons arise as objects of your mind. Attend to the interdependent factors of positing them as accumulators of karma and experiences of effect, and gain certainty about how interdependence is valid in the absence of inherent existence. And that's the key, and And if you, until you can ascertain that, until we can ascertain that, we've not understood emptiness, right? How things really do lack any intrinsic existence. And as he says here, and at the same time, they appear due to interdependent factors, so that causes, effects, karma, relationality are valid. That they're valid in the context of, or even because of, emptiness. And I'll just, and this is a point, right? Actually, it's an interesting point. Only Prasangika Majamaka philosophers, right, they say, can, what's the word? Can understand that point. Even other Buddhist philosophers assert some kind of interest. They think, so you can see how somebody could think this, right? Even non-Buddhist philosophers and even other Buddhist philosophers would say things have to have inherent existence in order to function, in order to be relational, in order to have, for causes to give rise to effect. Prasangika Buddhist Majamaka philosophers say the opposite. They say if things had inherent existence, then they couldn't have relationship. They couldn't serve as causes and effects. That they must be empty of inherent existence in order for causality to function. And here what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is, in light of your own meditation on emptiness, and I just want to go back and see this. He says, after he says you should let the undeniable appearances of designations of persons arise, his objects to your mind, he says, attend to the interdependent factors of positing them. Right? So he's saying pay attention to your actual experience of interdependence, right? Of dependent origination. And I think, again, like I'm just pausing, that's similar, right, to this point about, when you look at, because I'll use that example of the reflection in a mirror, right? Like, it's interesting, isn't it? There's an undeniable, if you look in a mirror, which many of us do every morning, if you're brushing your teeth or whatever, like, first of all, it's quite obvious that a face appears there. And it's obvious there's no face there. Like, there's no face existing inside the mirror. Right? That's obvious. That's not emptiness. We already said that. But how does it appear? Right? And you recognize, well, it appears due to various factors. Right? Just it appears due to causes and conditions. Right? So in other words, and it's quite interesting, right? That like, if you were looking at the details of your face in the mirror, of course those details don't exist in the mirror, yet they appear, right? Due to causes and conditions. And what he's pointing out is if you start to analyze and look, all your conventional appearances are like that. Right? Things appear, they're not intrinsically existent, but they appear due to causes and conditions, due to various factors. And if the factors are, what's the word? Correct or relevant, anything can appear. Isn't that true, actually? Like things you could never imagine would appear, if the causes and conditions come together, they appear. Right? Like people think, how often, actually, if you're old enough, sure, you've had some experience like where you think, oh, something will never happen, and then it happened. Right? Actually, probably everybody here is old enough to have had that experience where you thought, oh, this thing will never happen. It'll never be like that. And then it's like, and then you look around, and you go, oh my goodness, it's like that. I thought that would never happen. But how does that appearance arise? Because of causes and conditions, right? Because of many factors go into these appearances of our life, right? Yeah. And how does yourself appear? Due to many factors, due to many causes and conditions. And so you start to recognize what he's getting here is it's a mere appearance. Right? But it appears. And in that sense, you can't say it doesn't exist. Right? But does it exist intrinsically? If it did, it would have to be findable under analysis, which it's not. So no, it doesn't exist intrinsically. But things appear due to causes and conditions. Right? Without having, and actually, if things had any intrinsic existence, then they would be existent from their own side intrinsically, which is they wouldn't need causes and conditions. Right? But if you analyze your own experience, you start to see, well, things always do need causes and conditions. Everything that happens needs causes and conditions.
So my question is like, let's say I see an object outside there, and then I just see an object, and then I just, so do I immediately discriminate it, or do I have to feel it first?
Or do you have to what?
To feel the object first.
What was the question?
The question is like,
Oh, go ahead. Please.
so let's say I see you. Do I discriminate you first, or do I have to feel you first?
Feel or discriminate.
Feel like, do I have to like,
Yeah, I think discrimination comes first and then the feeling.
so how come in the five aggregates it comes third though? From
Feeling.
feeling discrimination. So that, yeah.
Yeah, they're both, actually, it's an interesting question because they're both omnipresent mental factors, so they're both always there.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking, because how could you feel something about Lisa if you haven't discriminated until you've
Because,
noticed that she's Lisa?
because you have to react. So without reacting, how can I label something?
Well, like, I'll give an example. Like let's say I'm feeling, like I'll give an example, because feeling is always there.
Yeah.
But like, here's an example. Like, so maybe I'll just give myself an example, right? Like, so let's say I'm walking along and my feeling is, there are three types of feeling, right? Pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm walking along and I'm feeling neutral.
Yeah.
Right? So then there's the neutral feeling, right, in that moment. And then I look up and I see Lisa, right? And at first, like maybe, well, actually at first when you, like it takes, like you see it, first you, actually, well, it's very subtle if you really slow it down, isn't it? Because if I was outside somewhere and I didn't know I was going to see Lisa, and I looked up, like and I'm from a distance, then first I would discriminate, actually it's interesting, let's say I'm in a distance, right? And so first I would discriminate, oh, there's a person there. And I might still be feeling neutral,
Yeah.
right? But then I'm walking towards Lisa, and then there comes a point where I'm like, oh, that's not just a person, that's Lisa. I have the discrimination, I discriminated, so first I discriminated person, like so I know she's not a tree, for example, but I still was feeling neutral, right? Then as I get closer, then I have discrimination that's Lisa. And then a pleasant feeling arises. Oh, how nice, it's great to see Lisa. So, so there's always a feeling there, but the feeling of, the pleasant feeling related to Lisa arises in dependence upon my discriminating her as Lisa then.
So don't you have to create a faster state of mind before you discriminate? Either as present, neutral, or present, neutral, or unpresent.
Yeah, that's always there. Yep.
So the feeling has to come first, because if you don't create a state of mind, then how are you gonna discriminate whether she's good or she's beautiful, she's ugly or she's beautiful? I mean, I don't know. I'm just guessing. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, that's other questions? So, okay, so you get this point though. So the key point is gaining certainty about how interdependence is valid in the absence of inherent existence. And that's in some ways the most, they say, the most challenging and also the most important point to gain insight into. Now he said, actually I'm sorry to say this, okay. How the analogy of a mirror image is necessary when appearances and emptiness appear to be contradictory. So he says, at a time when these two appear to contradict each other, you should take the analogy of a mirror image and the like, and consider how they are non-contradictory. Although the reflection of a face is empty of eyes, ears, and so forth, whatever appears, it nevertheless arises dependence upon a face, a mirror, and disintegrates when either of the conditions is gone. The two are undeniably contained in the common basis. You should train in the thought that likewise, although persons also do not have even a particle of inherent establishment, this does not contradict their accumulating karma, their experiencing effects, their being born in dependence upon previous karma and afflictions and so forth. You should know all such circumstances. Right? So what he's saying here is sometimes it'll seem hard. Right? I mean, this is part of the benefit of these similes for illusions. Illusion like, or, like a rainbow, like a, and same thing. Let's use. I mean, he uses the mirror, but I already said this. I'll use a rainbow, right, as the example for a second. Like, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because when you see a rainbow, actually, right, like sometimes like in my office where I work, sometimes if it rains, I would have to go to a certain window and look at a certain angle, and I'll sometimes see a rainbow. But you have to look in a certain, and it's quite funny, isn't it? Because I'll go like, oh look, there's a rainbow, right? And yet, like, I know, right? If I could take a helicopter and go up where the rainbow appears to be, I wouldn't see a rainbow there. There'd be no, you could never like go there and touch a rainbow, right? Or capture a rainbow. In other words, it's not, right? Because actually, how does a rainbow exist, right? Like we know that, right? So it's getting at many, what's the word? Dependent factors, right? So you need, why after the rain? There has to be water particles, right, in the air. And there has to be sunlight coming from a certain angle, right, hitting those water particles. And you also need an eye consciousness, right, to, that perceives certain color ranges, don't you? Right? And then a mind that labels that rainbow. Right? And you say, oh, it's a rainbow. Like for example, otherwise it's, so then there are all those factors, right?
But then you post it on Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. And then Jeff says, exactly. And so the idea is, right, so in other words, what he's getting at here is, on the one hand, sometimes it can seem like, how did he start this? He said, sometimes they seem to contradict each other, right? Sometimes you feel like, well, things have to inherently exist to exist, right? And what he's getting at here is he's saying, then use these metaphors, then use these analogies, right? And you start to see, well, a rainbow appears, and it's undeniable that it appears. And you can't say, like, there's a difference. Right? If I look somewhere where nobody can see a rainbow, and I say, oh, there's a rainbow, well, that's just wrong. Right? Even conventionally, there's no rainbow. It's totally wrong. Whereas if I look and point out a rainbow, and others on Facebook can say, oh, that is a rainbow, then it conventionally exists, right? There's a conventional agreement there's an appears, of an appearance. And yet, it only appears due to a wide variety, many different factors, let's put it that way, right? Due to many different factors, it appears, but it does, and I guess the point being this, is that, so one knows that one's contemplating, oh, the rainbow or the mirror image in the mirror, like there's no face there from the side of the mirror, right? And there's nothing out there that's a rainbow, right? That can be, that's in any way exists independently, right? It depends upon all those different factors, right? Including an eye consciousness and a mind, right? Labeling it rainbow. And what he's saying is you can use those analogies to then go, oh, in the same way my experience, like now to take it back. So then you would say, okay, well, and today I feel sad or scared or happy, right? And that feels so real, right? Independent. But then you say, well, that also is just appearing, right? There's all these different factors, right? There's a body with all these different parts, right, that came from countless causes and conditions. There's a consciousness which arose due to past consciousness, which arose due to consciousness before that, which arose due to consciousness before that, and as Dharma Kirti says, which goes back to the Bardo, and then to the past life, and then to the life before that, and so on. So due to many different causes and conditions, there's a body appearing. Due to many different causes and conditions, there's a consciousness, a present moment, right? And then, due to all these different causes and conditions, including one's past karma, and then the condition of maybe somebody who just said something you didn't like or something, now I feel sad, right? But it's just an appearance, like the rainbow. That sadness and the person experiencing it have no intrinsic existence, and yet they appear. Does that make sense? Or like the mirror image. They appear due to cause and conditions, and if they were inherently existent, they couldn't appear. Right? If they were an inherently existent sad person, well, then it already would have been there. It wouldn't have depended upon somebody saying something, right? The sadness only appeared because somebody said something I didn't like, right? So it means like the rainbow or like the mirror image, it's an appearance that depends upon causes and conditions. And the fact that it's appearing, first of all, due to causes and conditions, proves it doesn't have intrinsic nature, actually. So it's a way of when things seem like they're, what's the word, that they must intrinsically exist, you can use these analogies to get at this point about dependent origination, how things arise due to causes and conditions. Yep.
When you ask those questions, why do you see the rainbow when you look in the mirror, why do you see a face? Science is what comes to my mind. And I was listening to the Dalai Lama the other day, and he was talking, and he really digs science, and particularly digs quantum physics, which is wicked cool. So he was talking about, so we're, what are we made up of? Molecules. What are molecules made up of? Atoms. What are atoms made up of? Subatomic particles. What are subatomic particles? Energy. Pure energy. So, what I want to know is this pure energy exists from its own side?
Which, and some other people are probably more knowledgeable about particle physics than me, but even particle physicists say no, don't they?
I think one interesting thing is that, and I'm not a scientist.
You sound like one all the time. Come on.
From a quantum physics point of view, it sounds like it's not even energy, it's probability and an active observation. So you can't separate observation from, you get down to that level, there is no difference between the observer and the thing observed.
Right. Without the observer, there
Very
is no
tricky.
energy.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. Okay, my mind's blown.
It's like particle which one do you
No, it is not exactly.
Let's see, where are we up to now on the liquid prisms?
266. Oh, 266.
Oh, here we go, okay. At that time, the two appear, contradict each other, take the analogy. Yeah. Okay, so now, actually, and that's the end of the section on illusion light. Right now, the next section is settling the selflessness of phenomena. So I want to remind everybody, just to give context again, right? When we talk about emptiness, right? He said at the very beginning, he said, actually, from other tenet systems' perspective, there are different levels of subtlety between the selfless of person and the selfless of phenomena. Prasangika say they're equally subtle. Prasangika Majamikas. But you still can categorize them according to the basis, right? So one basis of understanding emptiness or selflessness is yourself, right? Person, meaning yourself as a person. And then the other is phenomena, things that are not yourself, right? But those things that are not yourself include your own body, for example, right? So there is it's a phenomena, it's a thing, like my arm, right? Even when I say my arm, then you start to analyze, right? But if I were to say my arm is not me, well then does my arm exist? In what way? Does my arm exist inherently? Right? And if somebody were going to do surgery on my arm, I would be definitely feeling like it exists inherently. So there'd be that feeling that would arise. And that would be the object of negation, right? So that could be a way of giving rise to the object of negation for a phenomena. It would be imagine somebody about to cut my arm, right? You can say, so it could be and so I guess my point is that phenomena, I've said this before, but phenomena could be things in your own continuum, like, you know, your parts of your body, or your discrimination, as we were talking about, or your happiness, or your sadness, or something like that. And it can also be things not in your continuum, a phenomena like a car, or a lamp, or a pen. But okay, so now we'll start that section. So settling the selflessness of phenomena. So he says here, the basis of designation of a person, right? So the basis of designation, right? That upon which we designate persons, right? And even there, he's already implied emptiness, hasn't he? Right? If you call those things the basis of designation, it means that person is merely designated, right? Anyway, the basis of designation of a person, the 5 aggregates, so we know what, everybody knows what those are, right? The 6 elements, such as the earth element, right? So those are earth, water, fire, wind, consciousness, and space. The six sense fields, so eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, and body and mind. You know, tactile, whatever, and mental consciousness, or mental sense field, rather. And their emptiness of inherent existence, established by way of their own entities, is the selflessness of those phenomena. Right, so what he's getting at there is just very simple. You can categorize phenomena in different ways, right? Forms, such as, you know, whether it be your own form of your body or an external form, could include that too, as a selfless phenomena, and then all these other things, right? So even, and we'll get it, even space is a phenomena, right? Consciousness is a phenomena. Wind is a phenomena. You know, there are all these different things that are phenomena. Right? And then he says there are 2 ways of settling it. Refutation transferring the reasoning explained earlier, and refutation by a means of another reasoning not explained earlier. So he's saying, if you want to, now he's going to say, so now if you want to meditate on selflessness of phenomena, of things, there are 2 ways to do that. One is to use the reasoning he already taught when he was teaching the emptiness of persons, and the other is he's going to give a new method. Does that make sense? So he's going to give you 2 choices. And there are actually, and I'll just mention, I mean, there are many other choices actually. If you look at the actual text, other texts by Lama Tsongkhapa, and the text by Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, I mean, there are many different reasonings. But here he's giving the ones that he views as particularly essential, right, for us in terms of practice. So refutation transferring the reasoning explained earlier, which he covers very briefly, because he's going to spend most of his time on a new reasoning. But in brief, he says, among the things that are aggregates, elements, and sense spaces, there are 2 types. So one type is physical phenomena. Right, actually, I'll just pause. One is physical and one is mental. That makes sense, right? So he's saying, with physical phenomena, you investigate both their parts in various cardinal directions, such as east, and that which possesses the parts. With consciousness, you investigate the temporal parts, such as the earlier and later ones, and that which possesses their parts. Having investigated whether they establish by way of their own entities as one or different, you refute them in the above fashion. That is the meaning of the sutra statement quoted earlier, and now he quotes the sutra. Just as you know the notion of self, apply it to everything mentally. Right, so he's saying here, in this method, you would, first of all, you're using the same reasoning, right? The reasoning of one and many, which is one of the, so there, as I said, there are many different reasonings to analyze emptiness. The one he taught for emptiness of self, the self of persons, was the reasoning of one and many, and now here he's saying you can also use that same reasoning to apply it to phenomena. And in brief, since he does it briefly, I'll do it briefly, right? So the first one is physical phenomena, right? So he's saying you have to do it differently if it's a physical phenomena versus a mental phenomena. You have to apply the method in a different way. So then he says, with physical phenomena, and use the example of a pen. So here he's saying, in that case, you would say, well, if a pen is intrinsically, inherently existent, then it has to exist as one thing or as many things, right? And so then you would say, okay, so if the pen exists, and so first of all, what's the basis of designation of a pen, right? First of all, there's the cap, there's the, what do you call it, the point, right? There's the thing that the point's attached to, I don't know what the name of that is. And then if we open this up, right, there's a, like, what's that called? The tube that has the ink in it, right? Yeah. And then there's the grip, right? The handle, whatever you call that. is the outside of a handle, is an inside of a handle. There's space between the handle and the tube also, right? There's some space in there. And so now he's saying the parts and the possessor of the parts, right? And so you're saying, is it one or many? So first of all, is it one, right? So you'd say, is there one thing intrinsically existent that's a pen that has to exist independent of those parts, right? Like if those parts are not, so if it's one, right? Well, then you would say, well, what's there to say, right? Is there a pen that exists apart from the parts? That's one thing, because we know the parts are many, right? So is there, and like, so is there a pen that exists apart from the parts that's a singular phenomena that doesn't, that's singular, that's just one thing? You say, well, that doesn't, actually, it's quite easy, isn't it, to say that's not the case, is it? Because if you know, like, there was, we already said, the pen exists in dependence upon its parts, right? So then you have to say, so then are there many pens? Or does the pen exist on just one of the parts? You know, so could you have a pen that's just the cap, for example? And actually, you know, if you took apart all the parts, I'd say quite interesting, isn't it? So, there's not. First of all, there are various ways that's problematic, isn't it? One is, if you said each part of the pen is a pen, well, but I only have one pen, right? So you can't say there are many pens in one pen. That would be logically, it wouldn't make sense, would it? And if you say that it takes all the parts, and that, you see, what you get to, I guess the point, let's just say it this way, the point you get to eventually is you start to recognize, well, if there were intrinsically existing, and actually go back, right? Actually, we skipped a point. I skipped a point. When you look at this, it seems like there's a pen existing there, right? And it seems to be a real, you say, is this a real pen? Yes, it's a real pen, it works, right? I can write. That's something came out. So it seems like, so it's a real pen in that sense, right? So then you say, so is it a pen that exists from its own side? Inherently, from its own side. And it seems to be, right? That's the object of negation. Does that make sense? So now you're saying, so in what does that exist? Right? And so anyway, then you go through that reason, right? If it exists as one, then it has to be, as a singular thing, it has to be independent of the parts. But there is no pen that exists independent of the parts. Then, if the pen is many, then you have many pens in one pen. And also, you know, each of the parts isn't a pen because it can't function as a pen, right? If you just had the ink stick, the ink tube, without anything else, it would just make a mess. It wouldn't be a pen, right? If you had the space between the ink tube and the outer handle, then that's definitely not a pen, right? You would just say, oh,
It's not dependent on the parts, it is the parts.
No.
It's not dependent on the parts, it is the parts.
Okay, what's the difference?
So it's one or it's many? No.
There is a pen.
So it's singular.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one.
Mm-hmm.
And but say your point again. So it's one thing that's many things?
No, it is the parts. That pen is the parts.
What if you replace all the parts? The car is an easier example, right? You replace the tires, same car, right? But replace everything.
Parts is not.
It's not dependent on those parts.
Different
Parts
example.
To me, whatever Jeff says makes sense.
I'm just asking a question.
Well, so what's the question though?
The pen is the parts. It's not dependent on the parts. It is the parts.
So you have to go back right to the pervasion, right? If a thing is truly this is the point of pervasion and the logical and logic, right? That they're giving, that this school is giving. If a thing is intrinsically existent or truly existent, then it must truly exist as one or as many. Right? So
I'm okay with that.
so then in this sense, the question would be: is it one or is it many?
It is one.
If
So you're saying
I
it's-
hand it to you separately, that's not a pen. So how could the parts be the pen?
It's, you have a pen. It is the parts. The definition of this pen is, it is the parts. It's one.
And so I guess the challenge there comes, right, if you accepted actually this is I guess what they would say, right? You accepted the premise that a truly existent thing must be one or many. And then they would say, you asserted it's intrinsically existent as one. But then you admitted that there are many parts. So you've contradicted yourself.
I didn't admit there were parts.
You said it is the parts. So parts is plural. So you accepted a thing, if it truly exists independently, inherently, it must be either one or many. But then you said the pen is the parts. So pen is singular, parts are plural. So you've contradicted. And actually, this is prasangika, right? They do consequential. It's an absurd consequence to your assertion. Was what I think a prasangika would say. Because you said you accepted a truly existent thing must be either one or many. But they said pen, which is singular, is parts, which are plural. So you've contradicted your own acceptance of the.
So you're saying that dependent on the parts and equivalency to the parts are the same things.
I didn't say that. Did I? I don't think I said that.
Well, that's the conclusion to what you just said.
All I said was that you contradict, that it seemed to me, all I was saying was that from this reasoning perspective, you contradicted. Like, you said a thing has to be one or, either you admitted that a thing has to be, and if it intrinsically exists, must be one or many.
Mm-hmm.
But then you said the pen, which is one, is its parts, which are many, so that's contradictory. Actually, that was all I was saying.
I'm saying the pen is not relevant to its parts. The pen is a unit.
The pen is
It
dependent
has nothing
on
to
the
do with
parts.
its parts.
Huh?
So now you're saying the pen is independent of its parts.
Uh-huh.
So can you show me a pen that exists without parts?
No, of course not.
Pen is dependent.
So again, then you contradicted. Like, that contradicts
I don't know.
the assertion. That's actually, it's great that you're asking these questions though, because that's really the method that Prasangika Madhyamaka uses, right? They assert a logical point, and then Prasangika actually means consequentialist, right? So they point out, Chandrakirti he tends to use that term, that they point out the absurd consequences of any assertion that includes an implication of intrinsic existence will end up with that's actually what they're saying, is that any assertion that it implies an assertion of intrinsic inherent existence is going to have absurd consequences to it because it contradicts how things how things are, and therefore they can point out those absurd consequences, and then the person will realize that those assertions don't make sense, and will let go of them, and will then realize emptiness.
So I'm pretending like I'm studying geology with a friend of mine, and we're learning about elements. What about an element something that cannot be broken down into any other parts? But I guess
But they can be.
geologically, it could be.
But you've already said it could, like, right, like, well, actually, you know it can, though, right? Because, like, I mean, you've said it earlier, right? Like, an element, like, has, if you, like, chords, I mean, only at that, but it,
I'm sorry.
oh, but, so there are no, like, electrons or protons that make up chords?
Okay, you can stop now.
Yeah. You said, like, it can't be broken down in one sense, but once you start to, of course it can in that sense, yeah.
Right.
And then electrons and protons, as you already said, you said it yourself, can be broken down into,
Right.
yeah, and
Which
so
has
on.
to be so.
So if following up from this topic there, if I were to say mere pen is merely the parts, would that be a correct statement?
A mere pen is merely the parts? Do you mean like, because here we're doing the reasoning of one and many, so I'm just confused, like you mean
Because it doesn't.
it's many, you're saying?
Pen doesn't intrinsically exist, and the parts do not intrinsically exist either.
Oh, I see, so you're not doing the reasoning of one and many, you're just trying to, like, you're saying, how does the pen exist?
Yeah, how does it?
Independent.
Yeah, so we would say that, I guess the correct way to say it would be the pen exists. You could say, actually, you could say the pen exists as a mere appearance, in dependence upon causes and conditions, or dependent upon parts. Yeah, you could say that. So you would say it's a mere appearance in dependence upon its parts, merely labeled on its parts. Actually, technically, I guess that's a good way to put it, isn't it? It's a dependent origination, merely labeled upon its parts.
So what's the word for many?
What's that?
Many. What other word can you use for many? One
Many, or plural, you could say.
Oh, plural.
Yeah, plural, many. Yeah.
Oh, many.
And then you do the same kind of, so that was a physical object. And then what he's pointing out here is with a mental object, right, like a mind, and there's a consciousness, so a phenomena, mental phenomena. So like consciousness, what he's saying there is if you want to meditate on the, using the reasoning of a singular or plural, or the meaning of many and one, if you want to do that reasoning and apply it to mental consciousness rather than a physical phenomena, then the parts are temporal. Does that make sense? So there, the parts of, so if you're doing it with your own mind, experientially, right? If you're meditating and you feel like your mind is, so again, you would first identify the object of negation, right? Which is, actually it's quite easy, isn't it? Like, if you're sitting there, I mean, it's not easy, but if you were meditating, right, you would first have to give rise to your sense of that your consciousness exists from its own side, or intrinsically, or inherently. Which if which actually, for example, which again is like, let's say it right. You might begin by, for example, when you're feeling like an intense emotion, right? Like if you were feeling deeply hurt, right? Your experience of your consciousness would not be that it's just exists in an illusion like matter. You would be feeling very much it exists intrinsically. So you would identify that object of negation, the intrinsically existent consciousness, right? And then the analysis would be, well, again, if there's an intrinsically inherently existent consciousness, it must exist as one or as many, right? And then you would analyze, well, if it existed, like, so if it exists as one, well, there's the consciousness of yesterday, and there's the consciousness of today, and the consciousness of tomorrow. There's consciousness of one moment. You can become smaller, right? Each second, each instant, even. And then you would analyze in the same way you already did, right? So you would analyze if the consciousness, actually, it's quite right. If the consciousness exists as singular, then it would be unrelated to all those moments, right? So there would be a consciousness that somehow exists that's totally unrelated to it, that isn't the present moment consciousness, it isn't the past consciousness, it isn't the future consciousness, but it's your consciousness. Well, that's doesn't make any sense at all, does it? And then you would say, does the consciousness, if the consciousness is each instant, then you have an infinite number of consciousnesses which are all unrelated to each other, right? That doesn't make any sense either, does it? Right. So again, you come to the same reasoning that both are impossible ways of existing. It's impossible for there to be a singular, right, a one consciousness that's unrelated to all your moments of consciousness, and it's also impossible for each moment of consciousness to be an inherently existent consciousness unrelated to what came before it and what after it, and so on. Anyway, and then you would come to this conclusion that the inherently existent or independent or intrinsically existent consciousness doesn't exist at all. Right? So that'd be that reason, right? Which doesn't mean consciousness, I'm just reminding you, doesn't mean consciousness doesn't exist at all, right? Consciousness exists in an illusion like matter, right? Independent, or you could say merely labeled upon its parts, which in this case are temporal parts. So it does exist. How does it exist? It's a dependent origination, it's merely labeled upon its parts, but it doesn't exist intrinsically or inherently. Does that make sense? And so those would be the ways to use the reasoning of one and many to meditate on the emptiness of phenomena, whether they're physical or mental. Okay, so
That's
good.
a question.
Yeah.
How how do we apply that to concepts that we create? Like, even the things they're talking about, like concept of aggregate or concept of emptiness. Because we said the emptiness also does not exist in and of itself. So how do we apply, like because that's why I feel like if we deny the existence, then that's why I'm feeling depressed or not. It's like if that does not exist, then what am I kind of trying to learn?
Well, the important is a really good point, because emptiness does exist, right? There is, like, first of all, emptiness does exist, right? That's one point. And actually one point is, right, and because it exists, if one, because it exists and it serves as and realizing it serves as an antidote to suffering and the causes of suffering, right? So it's an interesting point, right? Emptiness exists conventionally, right? And if one realizes emptiness, then it will serve the function as an antidote to suffering and the causes of suffering. And so, therefore, it's very valuable and wonderful to realize emptiness, right? To understand emptiness, and so on the one hand, one recognizes, and that's an important point, right? And then if we say, but if emptiness existed inherently and independently, if it existed in some independent way, this is actually, I'll put it in a kind of simple way, in a sense. If emptiness existed as some independent thing, then we could never realize it. It would be somewhere utterly, it would be like something completely separate from us, right? Because if it existed inherently from its own side and independently, then we would have no relationship to it. And we couldn't realize it. But because emptiness exists, it's because emptiness is what's the say this right? Emptiness is actually the nature of you, that you can realize it. See, so your emptiness exists depending upon you. And that's why you can realize it.
You mean in the... Okay, I'm confused. So I was thinking of it as like relativity. So there's the concept of emptiness, but for example, different lineages look at emptiness in a different way. So does that tell me that, conventionally, that emptiness exists as a mere label depending on how those different lineages look at it, and therefore how do I know the real, kind of the real truth on emptiness?
Actually, I'll say a comment on that one too. Then I'm not sure if this will get at your answer, but the Panchen Lama, first Panchen Lama, Losing Choki Gyaltsen, he was a teacher of the fourth and fifth Dalai Lama's great Lama, and he was very non-sectarian Lama, and he in his text on Mahamudra, he writes this very famous section where he says he lists all these different lineages of teachings related to emptiness. So he says, like, the Majjhimaka, the Prasangika Majjhimaka middle way school, and then Mahamudra, and which was what his text was about, and then Dzogchen. And then there are different sublineages of Mahamudra, and he lists them, like there are different ones. A certain school of Kagyus practice something called the amulet box Mahamudra, another called the severance Mahamudra, and then there's the Chud, like, lineage of Mahamudra. There are many different lineages, like you're saying. But then he says they have different labels, different names, and different methods, but they all come down to the same point. And what he's saying there is that all those lineages, when it comes down to the actual experience of realizing emptiness, they all realize the same thing. Actually, that's his assertion, that they realize the same reality, which is how the self exists, or how self doesn't exist. The actual ultimate nature of the self. So he says they don't actually, in the end, they don't, their terms may be different. Some of the methods, like, in Chud, they bang a drum, one bangs a drum, whereas if you're doing Majamaka, you're quiet, you're not banging anything, you're sitting like this, So there are different, like, external sort of, there are different words in the sense of Chud is a different word than Majamaka, which is a different word than Dzogchen. So there are different words, and then there are different kind of external methods. But I thought it was very interesting. He says, the way he says it, the Panchen Lama says, he actually says it this way. He says, for a yogi who's learned in both scriptures and also experience, for that person, they all come down to the same point. So he says, so he's saying this point, if you've studied deeply, but also from your own experience, if you actually practice them, then he said, then in the end, you realize the same, your realization's the same. It's the same taste. So that's his assertion. He says, so those different lineages have different words for that. They may have different external postures or something, different, some have music and some don't, whatever, things like that, at that time. But when it comes down to it, the realization, he says, is the same. That's his assertion. So it wouldn't be that they realize something different according to the hymn, and he's quite considered a great authority. So does that answer that part, or no? Okay. Yeah, no, he says they all come down to the same intended point. I think that's what he said. For a yogi learned in scriptures and insights, understands that they, and actually, I'll share what I always like. I'll just share. This is a personal thing I like very much. It's always the Dalai Lama has a book on that topic called the Giluk Kagyu Mahamudra Tradition. And I thought it was very funny because he says, because the Panchen Lama says, for a yogi learned in scripture and insight, they all come to the same intended point. And then I just thought this was funny. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, so obviously the Panchen Lama Loshin Choy Gyaltsen was a yogi learned in scripture and insight. He understood that. And then he said there was another later scholar who the Dalai Lama was quoting, and he says, this scholar says, I can't really understand. This scholar said, I don't understand how they all come down to the same point. Like, I don't understand what Loshin Choy Gyaltsen meant. And then his Holiness the Dalai Lama says, what he meant was this. And I was like, well, the Dalai Lama was obviously somebody learned in scripture and insight like the Panchen Lama, who kind of is easily able to explain how they all come to the same point, which I thought was a very beautiful point. So, I think what His Holiness was pointing out in quoting that other Lama who couldn't understand what the first Panchen Lama was getting at is that sometimes it's not easy for people to understand that. But for someone who really has learned but also practiced, and that's the point, I think, who's practiced those different traditions, then they realize how they come to the same point. Yeah, Linda.
I came across this on YouTube a few weeks ago that the Dalai Lama was doing extensive teachings on Dzogchen.
Huh.
I really, he actually got the teachings from Kanda Rinpoche's father. That was the main teacher. And I always thought of Dzogchen as not being connected with the Lukpa. But he was saying how for a long time he practiced more in the confines of the Lukpa. Maybe you understand this best. But and then he came to realize that these other lineages or whatever, the other teachings, that were as valuable, and he actually has gotten a lot from that, from practicing something. So I thought I was surprised, he acknowledged that.
Yeah, no, that's well. I mean, actually, there's a beautiful passage. They published. His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote like a biography of his teacher, Ling Rinpoche, who was his main tutor, his senior tutor. There's a beautiful description in that book where he said, he had been studying with Ling Rinpoche, was the head of the Gelugpa tradition, the Ganden Tripa, and he went to Ling Rinpoche and said, he was like an adult already and had studied for many years. And then he went to Ling Rinpoche and he said, he kind of asked for permission to study Dzogchen with Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche at that time. And Ling Rinpoche happily gave his permission. He said, of course, that's good. And actually, His Holiness the Dalai Lama also studied, like the Sakya tradition has the Lamdre, which has its own. If you list like those different terms, like I was saying, that the Lamdre has its. They call their view the non-differentiation of samsara and nirvana, which is a unique sort of presentation that the Sakya tradition holds. And His Holiness took that teaching from Chogye Trichin Rinpoche. So he took many different. Like that, from great eminent masters, like at that point, at that time it was Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche was the one, and then he also studied Dzogchen with what's his name? Who was Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teacher in Nepal, who was Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche's heart son, or one of his two.
I know what you mean.
remember his name right now, but yeah, no. So he studied Dzogchen with a number of different lamas. And actually, one other point I'll just share. Like I was actually thinking about just myself. I was kind of contemplating that point, and
Joseph Rinpoche?
Chultrik Rinpoche, yeah, who was a great disciple. Who was the head later. He was the head of the Nyingma tradition after Dowa Khyentse Rinpoche was. And Sonya's also studied with him. I know that too. And so Sonya studied Dalai Lama studied Dzogchen with various different lamas. And I'll share one other point. Like one. I was actually thinking about this sometimes and talking to some friends about it at one point because what they say is that like Lama Tsongkhapa himself, I guess, didn't really compose commentaries on Dzogchen. That wasn't his focus or his mission or something. But he studied, actually Lama Tsongkhapa himself studied Dzogchen. And there's a famous, if you look in, it's actually, some of the story is in, Robert Thurman published The Life and Works of Lama Tsongkhapa. It was an old book published in India, but Wisdom Publications reprinted it recently with a new edition. But anyway, Lama Tsongkhapa there's a famous story where he went and met with, his name was Namka Gyaltsen maybe, or I can't remember his name. Anyway, it was a great Nyingma Dzogchen master. And there's a beautiful description there where Lama Tsongkhapa went to meet, like this Lama, he heard that this Lama was an emanation of Vajrapani, this Nyingma yogi. And so Lama Tsongkhapa went to meet him. And they say that when Lama Tsongkhapa, he walked in the room and like, it was like an old, an old monk, I guess, but when Lama Tsongkhapa walked in the room, he saw blue Vajrapani, he saw like a blue deity. And they say when this Lama looked at Lama Tsongkhapa, he saw Manjushri. So they had these like visions of each other. And then there's a famous, actually Ling Rinpoche, the story goes that Ling Rinpoche, who was that, right, the Dalai Lama's senior tutor, who was, said that actually Gelugpa's owed a great debt of gratitude to this Dzogchen master. Because Lama Tsongkhapa said to him, he was already greatly realized, and he said, I'm thinking of going to India. I want to go to India and teach and study, and I'm going to go to Bodh Gaya and take my core students. He had many students, but he would take a small few group, and they were going to go to India. And that Nyingma Lama said to him, don't go to India. Like, you'll die, and you'll live, but your students the few students you have who you would take with you, many students who will leave behind, the few you take with you, they'll die of the diseases of India. And Buddhism was dying out at that point. It's like, wasn't very strong in India. And he said, you won't leave behind much. Whereas if you stay in Tibet and teach, and your lineage, your teachings will benefit many, many more people. So please stay in Tibet. Don't go to India. And that was like why Lama Tsongkhapa didn't go to India, and that there wouldn't have been actually, I guess, like a Gelugpa tradition if this Nyingma Dzogchen master hadn't suggested that he not go to India at that point, because it was quite early in his teaching. I mean, it wasn't, maybe not quite early, but it was still fairly early in his teaching career. And then there's this interesting text, actually, that Bob Thurman includes in that book, where Lama Tsongkhapa didn't write it, really. I guess he wrote it down, but it was a conversation between Vajrapani and the Nyingma master with Lama Tsongkhapa there, where they were talking about, and it mentions some Dzogchen ideas. I was reading, I was going, this sounds like Dzogchen. I don't really know. I don't understand Dzogchen, so I wasn't quite sure. But so Lama Tsongkhapa, and I guess the point is that apparently Lama Tsongkhapa did study. He studied Dzogchen with that master, and Lojong also with that master, but didn't write extensively on it. So there's not like a tradition of writing about it. My own personal view, which I agree with Panchen Lama, Losing Chogi Gyaltsen, he's actually my favorite. Apart from Lama Tsongkhapa, I just love him very much. Panchen Lama, Losing Chogi Gyaltsen. I actually think the Gelugpa presentation, Gelugpas, they rely, in terms of emptiness, as we see here, Lama Tsongkhapa is very clear, right? He's relying on Chandrakirti's presentation of the view. And then in Tantric context, although Lama Tsongkhapa wrote extensively on many different tantras, his commentaries on the Guhya Samaja Tantra are considered very valued, I guess, or something. And this is just my personal opinion now. I think if you relate what Lama Tsongkhapa says in his text on emptiness and what he says about, from a tantric perspective, about the Guhya Samaja system, if you relate those two, I think that's how the Panchen Lama comes to his conclusion. That you come to the same point. So you have to understand, in a way, to understand how this also relates to the Dzogchen teachings, for example, which are tantric teachings, ultimately. You'd have to include Lama Tsongkhapa's teachings on Guya Samaja or some of the tantric teachings. And then you would see, when they put those together, you see how they all come to the same point. That's my own thinking, but I don't, I'm not a scholar in yogi. I'm not, I don't fulfill the criteria that he had, so I'm not really sure. But that's my thought. Last thing, and I'll stop.
So, Dr. Lawrence, so just a curious question. So His Holiness Dalai Lama, when you learn this stuff from Kali courses or from Dilgo Sensei's courses, what I've understood is like it takes him like a day or two. It's called transmission, sort of.
Say again, that last part?
It's called transmission, I think there's some sort of thing that happens
Right.
in that learning. Just curious, like how does that work? Like when I struggle so much to learn a small little thing for like months and years, how does it really happen?
One thing.
Is it true? First?
I'll just share one experience, not some deep, but one time I was asking, one day I was having this conversation with Yume Kintsu Rinpoche, who and I was saying transmission, sometimes that's we translate, that's usually a translation of, in Tibetan, the term lung, like receiving the lung of something, like receiving the transmission. And I said to Kintsu Rinpoche, I said, I was being very direct, and I said it takes a long time, so some texts are quite long and complicated, and then to receive the lung, the transmission, it can take a lot of time, And then I said, I speak English, it's a lot in Tibetan, if you get the transmission. And I said, so is there what's the point? Is there any point to that? And Kintsu Rinpoche said, yes. Yes. It'll help you understand. It's the idea, I think, of a transmission is that it's, say you're receiving a transmission of a teaching, I'm just giving an example of a teaching from Lama Tsongkhapa. There's something magical about that in a way, not magical in the sense, I don't know how to say it right,
Race.
It's I was going to give a conventional analogy for a second. I remember this, when I was, I've written a little bit, I've written some books or something. I remember when I was in college, and I was trying to get into a class with a writing teacher who I very much liked, who had won a Pulitzer Prize and all that, and she was a very famous writer, and then I got into the class and we became friends. And she was very supportive of me and kind to me and gave me critiques on writing and explained writing to me. And there was something that changed for me. It was well, now I've studied writing with her. It's different than when I was just before that I was interested in writing, but then I was it was some experience of well, now I've studied that. And the same thing happened in psychology. When I was, I went to school to study psychology, right? But then when I did internships, and there were a couple of times where there were therapists who I thought were amazing, great therapists, really amazing, and I would sort of sit with them and talk, and they would supervise me, right? And we would talk about cases where there's something that comes through that's beyond. It's you develop a confidence in your own ability to do something because you've sat personally with somebody. It's different than reading a book or an online seminar. It's you sat with a person and you've had an affectionate connection with them and they've cared about you and they sort of transmit something to you that's of their own experience. And I think, so I'm just giving a conventional analogy. Then I think in the terms of Dharma, it's like that. So in other words, and I'll just share one story. I remember this one time, I was at Kopan, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche was going to give a transmission, something like that, of something that came from Naropa. And I remember I was sitting outside the hall. He was in the hall and nobody else was allowed in, and I was sitting outside, and I was just overwhelmed with emotion. I was Naropa. I love Naropa. He's this great Indian master, right? And it's and there's this idea, it's an unbroken lineage, right? That Naropa taught it to Marpa, or Marpa taught it to Milarepa, Milarepa taught it to somebody, and it came down to Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and then you look at Lama Zopa Rinpoche and you think he's no different in terms of his inner qualities than those people. And now I'm, so there's no, I think it develops a confidence. It's well, Milarepa received it from Marpa, who had realized it. And then if you're there with someone like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's real, it's different than it's that's why I said it's somebody who's actually realized that, and where it's unbroken coming down. So I think there's a blessing, but there's also a confidence, and there's a transmitted energy or something that comes through that I think we have in other spheres. That's why I gave the example. For me, it was writing or psychology. it's something that you do, you know, where you realize like, oh wow, it's like where you receive the transmission, it's like you receive a kind of confidence and a blessing to be able to do it then. And without that, it's not that you can't learn, of course, but there's a difference actually, you know. And I remember that Bob Thurman said that when he translated his translation of the Lama Tsongkhapa's, it's called, he calls it the, you know, the differentiating the interpretable and the definitive, the essence of eloquence text. It was very interesting. It's like he's a translator, right? But he said, and then I received the all-important oral transmission from so-and-so. I think it was from Ling Rinpoche or somebody like that. But you have the sense that like he wouldn't even translate it if he hadn't received that, because he wouldn't have the confidence to think that he had, you know, he hadn't received the lineage, he hadn't received the energy, he hadn't received, and somehow to be with, you know, someone like Ling Rinpoche, right, who was the holder of Lama Tsongkhapa's, in that time he was the main holder of Lama Tsongkhapa's, of those teachings, and that he would transmit it to him. So there's something about that, I think, that's like, it develops a confidence and a blessing and a karmic disposition to be able to later study it and realize it, and it's different if you haven't received that, I think. So I do think there's some, not that you can't study without that, but I think it makes it, you know, I wonder about that, and that was why I asked Kyume Khyentse Rinpoche, but I think what he said is correct in that sense, that there's a blessing and a transmission and a confidence, and a kind of relationship also, a relationship to the person, but also to lineage, and that is unbroken going back. And there's something about that, isn't it? It would feel it, like somebody actually read it, like Lama Tsongkhapa read this to so-and-so, who read it to so-and-so, who read, and now I'm part of that transmission. There's something moving about that, I think, also.
But just the way, when they do it, it's so fast. When Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he does it, it's so fast. It's not at the level of anybody understanding what's being said. To me, that's indicative of sort of just the energy transfer, that it's not relevant when you hear all the words. It's what's behind them that's happening.
Yeah, there's something relational though, right, to Rinpoche himself.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the which is like, so the supreme jewel bodhicitta, for it has not arisen, may it arise and grow, for it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.